Okay, good to go.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us all week, but especially here, the final roundtable. If I haven't met everyone before, I'm Sharon Tomer, I'm part of the research group. And we wanted to hold one final conversation for everyone, particularly the participants, to sort of give us reflections and maybe even some good debate on this week and sort of this project that we've tried to set out kind of in general in the research group, particularly here this week in the conference, of trying to identify and unpacking the terms through which we can try to re-theorize housing and sort of try to set forward a new agenda for housing. Before we begin the conversation, I just have some thank yous. First of all, to all of the participants. It's really been an incredible week and so stimulating and informative. I say this, I think for some people it's been late in the evening. For me, these have been very, very early mornings from the US, 5 a.m. every day, and never did I feel like I was about to fall asleep. I've been just going and going all week. It's been really amazing, and the presentations were really rich and dense and provocative, and the discussions were incredibly insightful and deep. We at some point looked at the schedule and said, what, 3 hours for each session? No, somebody messed up. And yet we often had to cut them short. So it's really been an amazing time. I want to thank all my colleagues, especially those who were in Jerusalem much longer than I was and did a lot of the heavy lifting to make this all happen. But I think also just the incredible conversations we had in Jerusalem that got us here, to Dana Silverstein for just keeping us all together and really, really making this happen, and to the Institute for providing the funding and the space for us all to come together. So thank you to everyone. So at this point, I just want to invite everyone to kind of join the conversation, to reflect on the conversations this week and to try to understand sort of what we're talking about when we talk about housing, and particularly this approach that we've taken to try to sort of approach the topic through language and through terms. So what are your thoughts about this approach? And to kick it off, I can offer some thoughts, and they're very fragmentary, not at all anything conclusive or summarizing, because I've been thinking a lot as the week's been going on about this question that was sort of raised at the very beginning Monday morning in the introduction to the session, which is sort of what are we talking about when we talk about housing? And so what sort of jumped out at me as the week has gone on is two themes. And there's probably many, many more, but these are two that have really come out to me. One is that we're talking about production, and we're talking about production in a whole lot of different terms and ways, that we're talking about housing is interrogated. We're exploring what's involved in producing housing, what production of housing even means, and what's at stake in its production. So for example, I think the concept of agency, which we saw in one specific session, but in numerous papers, so questions of participation, of tenure, of activism. I think that that's a type of question about production, about who gets to participate and how and what constructs production of housing. I was thinking of Silke Kapp's amazing distinction between production and consumption of housing. Thinking about the role of finance and all the sort of finance and development and market mechanisms that come into housing, questions about regulation that we've seen come out in very different, very interesting sort of ways. Questions about experimentation seems to be a sort of key thing that's coming out as we think about housing. And then even questions about production from sort of almost the non-production side, which is sort of, preservation, which Sandra was talking about this afternoon, or demolition, which we talked about yesterday, that these different modes of production are sort of key to what we're thinking about or talking about when we talk about housing. And then the second theme for me has been about content. What is the content of housing? So in some ways, this refers to design questions. And we really set out this, this conference and this group that we're really interested in thinking about housing specifically from an architectural perspective, that it gets so widely, it's been so widely covered in the last few decades through planning and legal and other frameworks, but the architectural framework. So I think the question of the content of housing is really important, and sort of, what makes housing, particularly mass housing, a particular realm of architecture. So for me, some of the terms that started to get at that were the questions of flexibility, which we've seen come up also at many points through this week, questions of sharing. I think that housing is particularly about a notion of sharing in very different ways. And then terms like habitat, which we were just saying in the last session, has sort of come up so many times in this conference, and terms like milieu. So these for me were sort of two themes that come out. And I want to open it now to other participants, my colleagues that want to jump in, sort of maybe what you also saw and heard, or questions or contentions, critiques you might have about how we've sort of opened up this question, or what you've sort of gotten out of us trying to ask the question. I think Gaia said it in the last session in a very nice way, that we've constantly over the last year plus have sort of been drawing this map in our sort of what we think the terms of housing might be. And we keep seeing ourselves in this conference sort of redrawing that map, and maybe what you've seen as the kind of terrain of the map. So if anyone would like to jump in, please do.
Maybe I could add something for the beginning, because I want to say something very basic. I think that the first idea of the project, the main idea of the project, to bringing together these three elements, which is terms, architecture and housing, or more precisely, terminology, disciplinary questions, and questions regarding the reality of housing. These three issues put together gave us the opportunity to be very diverse and to be able to relate, even if we came from very different environments and with different preoccupations. So this kind of frame let us be who we are and do what we do. And also I would like to remind that one of the ideas from the project was the idea of manifesto. So looking for words that are maybe even provocative. And there was a diversity of terms in the conference. There were terms that were mistranslated, and maybe a failed terminology, thinking of the last session. Terms that were so vague, or became so vague, that they needed declinations. And also an important fact, in my opinion, that terminology is still in the making. There were some very recent terms, and that we should be open to remain open. And I want to thank for the three elements. Of course, I would like to thank Gaia, Yael, and Suzanne, because they established this very well thought frame for us. So thank you.
But maybe I add just one thing. Our idea was really, as Sharon said, since we had plenty of opportunity, and we'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss and to talk among us, to ask the participants to share with us their feelings, even criticities that emerge over the 5 days, suggestions, contributions that can be extremely helpful also to understand how to go ahead with this project, because of course a line, a path, I think it's emerging and it's very interesting. But at the same time, as Dana was saying, what I found really interesting in this conference is that we had a clear configuration, a map of terms, and we defined some titles, let's say, categories for the sessions that were sometimes labels, sometimes oversimplifying, of course, to create some families. But what I found interesting, how the contribution and the papers allowed us to question this label, or sometimes enrich it with contents, with meaning, these categories. So in my opinion, a new configuration really emerged. There are terms that were in separate sessions where emerged affinities, or that can be observed in tension also, and paired maybe for subsequent research, or also for the book showing interesting connections. So it's something that spontaneously, I think, emerged through the conference, but that could make possible also thanks to the contribution of all the participants. So now it seems a fragmented glossary, but probably it's going to take shape in the next steps. And what of course emerged, I think it's this idea, this need to qualify, to define certain terms and to rethink the vocabulary or housing through certain new notions and concepts that can be introduced, emerged in a very clear, clear way. And then I conclude, I think that, like Sharon said, one of those, the challenges that was not in our purpose at the beginning, but that emerged, in my opinion, as a real achievement, is that not only is a map of term, but is a map of recent tendencies in housing studies that emerged over the last decade, at least, with very diverse angles and perspective, but was also an occasion to establish a dialogue and an exchange of very diverse how can I say, research traditions, mode of doing research, and research cultures that it's, I think, sometimes rare to put together. So I think this is something that worked, in my opinion, well. So now...
Yes, I think, can I speak? Yes. Yes, sorry. Yes, the question is that, is it a glossary we want to do or something else? I'm not sure. I have been before in another team of research about the worlds of cities, and it was very formal, and there was a very strong methodology, and it was clearly different. And I think that maybe it's not a glossary exactly. Maybe there's a link with the narrative questions. I felt that in different, and maybe as Gaia said, there is also a challenge to build a bridge between housing studies. Is a very formal, very strong tradition in housing studies. I know a little the network around that, especially in Europe, and architecture. And I think it's we are building now in France a lot of bridge to say to the architect to come back to the housing questions. And it's a very urgent question, I think, also. And there is also a challenge on international perspective on this question between housing and architecture.
Yes, Carmen.
I have just a second. My micro functions. I have a very practical question, which comes from frustration, from the fact that there were parallel sessions And also because of the length of the conference, I was not able to follow everything. So my practical question is somebody among the organizers whom I more than heartily thank here, able to wrap up a little bit for us some, well, not general ideas, but well, sort of give us an overall impression about the conference.
Is there anyone?
I'm happy to respond to that. I think it's not
Almost
possible
doing,
because
no?
each of us had exactly the same experience as you did. We were only in one or the other session. And
Susanna, I'm sure, but at least you were able to read all the proposals and to read also the papers. So, but hence my question. It's not that I believe that some of us have the power to be in the same spot.
I actually believe that, at least from the papers that I responded to in the two sessions that I chaired, that they evolved enormously between us receiving the abstracts, us receiving a paper, responding, and then now the actual presentation. So even that I don't feel comfortable doing. I think if I have an overview of the topics, and I've read the abstracts, but I've actually only engaged closely with the speakers in the sessions that I chaired. So I don't think it's possible to wrap up. I can reflect on my sessions, but maybe somebody else would like to do that. So I'm gonna stick with the fragmentary view.
I could offer an observation that is more general than specific. I hope this satisfies your question, Carmen. My observation is that more than focusing on specific findings brought up in the individual papers or the specific thematic titles that each session had, what has been happening in the past 4 days has been maybe a new discourse within this community, within architecture, regarding all of these issues that Sharon was covering. What do we mean when we talk about housing? How do certain sub discussions within this realm play out? Forming, and I was really struck by how lively these discussions were. I mean, Sharon was not exaggerating about that, and we did lay out these 3 or 3.5 hour time slots for 4 papers, and we were like, okay, I mean, well, we may have these breaks between them, and we never had any break. It was pretty crazy, and for me, this means that there is a lot of interest in this discourse, that there is, and for me, it signals an opening for the future discussion. I don't think that what we now have is a full consolidation of the terminology of housing. I don't think any of us believes that. What we have is 55 terms, 55 attempts, 16 kind of maybe thematic vessels for discussing these. It's the much more than what we had in September of 2019 when we started, right? And I'm really hopeful that in the future publications, we are planning a book and a journal special issue and a future conference, that we would be able to make this into a live, ongoing discussion where the things we think we know now would become richer. And as Suzanne said, from abstract to paper, to comments, to presentation, all of these terms have evolved. And so as a general reflection, my reflection is that we are looking at a field. And this is wonderful and new to me.
I do believe, like Susan, that things are fragmentary and we should look at them as being fragmentary. But what I think it's important, hence the fact that I asked this very simple, practical question, is the way things were treated here, dealt with here, you were speaking, both of you, about this evolution of the way of conceiving of housing and the terms related to housing. And I'm sure that the conference gave us more ideas. This is the reason I wanted to know a little bit more about it. Would the recordings be accessible? Sorry to ask again such blunt questions.
Well, our intention is to at least share all the recordings with participants. I think this is agreed by all of us. Kind of a follow-up question is: will we be sharing what we produced in this conference with the larger academic community? And this would require getting everybody's permission. This is a process. I hope this works out and that most people would agree to be included, and that our videos would be shared. Some of my students and colleagues already asked me for some of the recordings.
Yes.
There is. I'm sure that some people feel that they, I don't know, chose a session. I mean, it was very hard to decide. They wish they have attended the other session as well. And I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying.
I'm just going to add one more comment. I think one thing that came through in the sessions that I attended is that, and in addition to the keynote lectures that we heard, is that really the architecture can't be dissociated from political thinking and political. There was a question about how we talk about it in an academic setting. How does that relate to how activism or actually action in the field? That was a concern in the last session. And it was interesting that Nimrod Regev actually proposed a design. And around this design, we had very fundamental discussions about what would make it possible was a design for a assembly architecture. So the attempt to propose a cheaper way of building to provide universally accessible housing for Israel. But through this very proposal, we had very fundamental discussions. And ultimately, Nimrod's main, I'm paraphrasing now, but Nimrod's main answer to why this isn't already being built was a very political one that we have to change the way taxation works. So I think that's one of the things that came through across the fields is that, or across the sessions, is that architecture is a way of entering and understanding a broader set of concerns. In this case, we're talking about housing, but that we can't disassociate these things. And that again comes to the fundamental question of how can we think architecture, if we think of that as a distinct discipline, and housing, if we think of that as something else, how can we bring that together? And just one last comment, I think, whether glossary or what this is, I think to me, the point is not to come up with a new list of terms that we can now use, which have now been approved by us, and this is how we're going to talk about it, but rather to understand, and so not to be normative in any way, but to understand what language does and what it does when we talk about universal. That can imply, universal access. It can also imply top-down standardization. So to understand the way we, even if we came up with a new set of terms, those would also have embedded in them a certain set of assumptions. So I think that's maybe my key term. It's not about we don't want a new set of approved terms, but we want to see this as Gaia said in the introduction, this is a method of understanding how our thinking reacts or relates to our doing.
Carmen, I understand perfectly your point and your question, but we decided together yesterday that having only 1 hour of roundtable, it was for us definitely more challenging to receive comments, feedback from the participants than to synthesize something that I think neither in our idea is very clear right now, because we jumped from.
I didn't mean to to cut short the flow of questions, because I realized that by asking that, I realized after I asked that, because otherwise I wouldn't have.
I understand your comment perfectly.
So it was pure frustration. I was very interested about some other sessions, and I couldn't follow them, and several times I had to teach, and also I
had the same feeling, so I can perfectly understand you. No, I know. Now,
So,
I think for us,
and come back to intelligent questions or comments.
no, I would like just to highlight what both Suzanne and Yael said before, that what I found really, the title of our proposal project was Retheorizing the Architecture of Housing as a Ground for Research and Practice. And this was a kind of frustration, because the part on practice was a little bit on the margin of our discourse over the 10 months. But the aim of this conference was really also to try to establish an exchange between scholars and practitioners on these terms, not only to define the terms, but really to understand this urgent need that is emerging to in some way reconsider and rethink certain terms, certain notions, and more in general the vocabulary that we use today to describe and to talk about housing. What I found really interesting is to see how the same term, maybe with different declination or translation, but usually the same concept, was observed really in relation to specific usages, a specific situation, with the very diverse perspective, in the language of the market, in the language of policymakers, in the language of inhabitants, in the language of designers. And so I think this multifaceted analysis of the term, that sometimes also contributed to disentangle our idea, our notion of term, was very, very interesting. Not only observing the terms in its migration in time and the space, but also in this shifting from one field to the other. I found this very, very challenging. But I would like to invite our participants to any kind of comments will be more than welcome.
Priscilla, please.
I can take a step. No, I wanted to thank for for being selected, I guess, for having my paper to present. But thank you for the organization and for such a stimulating debate, and but for proposing this way to rethink about housing through the terms of habitation. I was just looking again to the call for papers, and I was, when you read it seems much more certain about, there's a certainty in what is going to be discussed. The crisis of, we are living in a situation of housing crisis, which I agree completely. And as I was reading it and then listening to what you're saying and listening to the whole week of discussion, I think that the organizers will be much less certain after the conference than before, and which I think it's a good thing. But anyway, but that's there was stimulating debate, and but what I felt in the participation. So first is very interesting for me, not such a familiar approach to approach the issue of housing or urbanization through an investigation of the term. I think it's very stimulating. I think, however, that the context is very important. So, by today's Thursday, right? Like by Wednesday, I gave up to think about, we have universal issues with housing, but we cannot, I don't think we can think about them universally. I kept comparing the discussions in Europe with Latin America, and sometimes it becomes too forceful, so context is very important, and maybe one word missing is context, but that and I think that that can be a very rich thing as well. And another concept that I thought in this issue of crisis that we miss somehow is vacancy. I don't know if there was the discussion of vacancy in the other sessions, but yeah, I thought that vacancy was missing too. I agree with Suzanne, and I was in this last panel with her, that at the same time that there is this effort to find again the role of architecture and the role of the architect in this housing crisis, the architect cannot be this naive designer, or I mean, no offense intended, and or the student of architecture thinking about the design sometimes even without knowing, like this placeless design. And this was so key for us when we were discussing about land, but not just land, but land and taxation. So the architect has to be much more political, much more informed, sharper about what's going on around. So those were the takeaways. And I think we, maybe when you're thinking about the terms of habitation, how do you operationalize, even if you're thinking about a publication, a book, but a living document as well, right? Because again, this changes according to the context, and then you can have like terms of habitation, global south version, I don't know. But it's a living effort, I think. But yeah, thank you, very stimulating.
Yankel, please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to say to Priscilla some kind of things. I agree with her that some words, some terms are missing, like vacancy, for example. The context, I think we have to deal with the context, because it's not comparison, and we are not doing comparison, but we are doing, we are listening to some kinds of narratives who are parallels. And for example, with the question of crisis, the question of housing crisis is completely reiterative. It begins all the time. The story of housing is in the core of in the story of housing in every context. But a crisis, it's normally is a moment. And in our situation and in our fields of housing, the crisis is permanent. So it's not a crisis, it's a permanent structural questions. And it's a structural question who organize the field. And we are here in this field of housing because there is a crisis. And if there were not a crisis, we will not be there. So I think we don't have we have to take seriously the term of crisis. Of course, people suffered, etc., etc. But I think also that we have to take it in the context of professions, capabilities, and all the things like this. So the question of crisis, the word, the term crisis would be interesting. It would be interesting to have it in the terms, but with a special focus, I think. I don't know if you share my impression about this question of crisis.
May I jump in very quickly, very quickly? Oh, sorry. Perhaps there was somebody else who wanted.
Giovanni raised his hand, so perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. But in case Alice was just jumping in the previous question, okay, yeah, please speak. I will speak later.
Carmen.
I would like to comment on the idea of crisis. And the fact that the housing question, when Engels published the housing question, it was presented as a crisis, wasn't it? And the main thing that was addressed as being the core of the crisis, and which is still addressed time and time again, is the fact that not the responses miss. What misses is another way of framing the thing and trying to instill policy in it, and also to bring inhabitants to think differently about it. So perhaps the conference contributed to that.
So Giovanni,
Okay.
Giovanni, please go.
Giovanni, and then I think
Well,
Marianne.
just to extend what was put on the table by Priscilla just a few minutes before, in a perspective also of a follow-up of this work, of this conference. I think that maybe it comes from some kind of enthusiasm from actually the professional context I am squeezed in, but an interesting way to envision a follow-up of this work should be maybe a larger involvement of practitioners. We had lots of practitioners. We had of hybrid, I would say hybrid actors participating to this conference, bringing research issues coming from practice. But I think that not just hearing the voice of practitioners in defining what they think about the meaning of the terms of habitation, but actually debating these terms with I would say also with people more connected to the market. We had a session for it, of course. Connected to the market and to I would say, let me just say, plain practice with no offense intended. I think that maybe outreach will be an interesting term to consider, an extension of the works of this conference.
Marianne, please.
So just a few remarks. Then I was shocked, though I didn't have time to count the number of mentioned terms, that somebody taught here that 55 terms were listed within the conference papers. And this was really shocking. And though I was not able to attend each panels as well, and not only because of the parallel sessions, but my feelings after attending only a few of them, I had that the terms can be increased, the number of terms can be increased, like it was added, so crisis, why didn't we mention also the crisis? And I think that anybody could add more and more terms. So I would, how about, what would be if you, I suppose that you have all the contributions, so because we had to submit a paper. And now if you have the possibility to read those papers and to make such smaller groups of them, which would could be arranged according to the main aspects. I mean, that's the architectural aspect is the first, or the political aspect is the first, or the market approach is the first. So it would be help to decrease the number of many of these concepts and terms, and to put together, to decrease the ways, the fringes, which we can which you have to follow.
If I can just say something, I think part of what you're talking about, a few of you now, is something that we thought about early on, and I guess it's interesting to see it as a question that rises again, whether we should start from the terms and then look for the papers, or look for papers and then let the terms come up, right? Like, in a way, if you look at the terms that we have listed on the program, those would not be what I think any one of us would sit down if I asked you, now give me the 50 most important terms in housing. You know, I do not think we would end up with this list. But that kind of openness to understanding what language actually historians or architects or whoever is dealing in the field, what terms are actually coming up for them, felt, starting from that rather than going top down from the terminology, felt to us a kind of a worthwhile experiment, whether or not it's successful, because perhaps we're missing very central aspects, as you have rightly brought up. But it seemed to me to be worth it to gain that kind of unexpected plurality and access to kind of micro histories that we might not otherwise have thought to look for, as well as actually, I think it brought out a sense in a sense of how these terms are actually so often not about precision in architectural discourse, but rather kind of actions, right? These words are doing something. They're either persuaders, they're linking, they're ways in which architects are linking, or historians are linking themselves to ideologies or to particular historical narratives, right? They're promoters. These words are so often doing something. Other times we're getting very precise little scalpels into little moments that have passed away, and and the terms would not come up on our list because they failed or because they were so small, but actually by attending to that term, we get to something we would otherwise, to the kind of roughness of practice that historians professionally buff away, right? So I think just to add that comment.
So my suggestion was not to eliminate all the already existing 55 terms or even more, but just to make a structure of them. So I think because some kind of terms may appear in several contexts.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I'm not saying anything against what you're saying. I completely agree with you in everything everyone was saying. I just wanted to explain perhaps how we got here. And
yes, I agree, because you are after more than a year work. So, and I joined just for one conference paper.
And I think the fact that certain terms are showing up in multiple papers in itself is something we need to start. It would be an interesting place to start the next step of thinking, like, oh, what are the terms that are coming up in these very different contexts, and why are those terms relevant to our discourse today in a particular way, or were they particularly strong globally at a particular moment? So just that kind of sieve that multiplicity can offer, perhaps.
But I think that context and the way terms were used were part of the success and richness of this conference, in the sense that it was this continuous to and fro between the local context and the larger context, and then terms that were used in so different manners, and terms that circulated not only from one discipline to another, but also chronologically speaking. The way flexibility, I'm taking flexibility because I use it as a sub-term in my paper, because I was afraid that if I will use another term, the organizers will be very upset with me, and then I realized that not. So flexibility appeared in many papers, and it was also one of the terms that pop up in many of the discussions. But I am sure that It's not that I'm sure. I know because when I used it, I had a different thing in mind. And now I'm really very happy with all that I've learned about flexibility, including about flexibility in Romania. So I thank Dana when she quoted one of the essays that was published in Arhitectura in 1970s. So yeah, no, I think that the richness was precisely this kind of ambiguity also of the thing, and the way, well, ambiguity. I don't have. I would dare to borrow Samip's term in his keynote when he was speaking about haziness. This unprecision of using things.
I just want to. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Sharon.
No, I just wanted to point out the time to make sure that we have 10 minutes, which means I just invite everyone to continue to speak. But if you have something you've been waiting to say, please come join the conversation. And
okay,
yes.
So if I could really shortly, very briefly reiterate something that Carmen was just saying, many of the papers were actually talking about a number of terms. Carmen was talking about 4 terms. I was talking about 3 terms. Anna was, anyway, many of us had a kind of an opening term, and then which opened a plethora of subterms. And those subterms may have been the primary term of a different paper. So the term is just an opening. It's kind of a door into a certain discussion, a certain outlook. They are a method. Rather than a purpose, they are a method, I think, for our exploration. And this is why, in my mind, they have been so productive in producing such a great number of very rich papers.
Jankel, you were going to say something a few minutes ago. I think you put it in the chat, but if you want to say it. Oops, I think you're muted.
Put in the chat, but just the idea is that yes, terms are opening something, and they're opening different kind of things. They're opening to values, different kind of values, and it's interesting. And also about keywords in the politics, in policies. For example, available, affordable. It's keywords were for policies in housing policies, and so we can also have a direction to see the values and the use of these values.
Did we have affordable as a term?
We had, yeah.
We had.
Yes, we had.
Okay.
Absolutely. And it sprang a very interesting discussion around.
Yes.
See, I missed half the sessions, literally.
So. Because it was discussed at close to needs, and so it was very interesting.
So I really encourage the participants to say something. This is your chance. Let us know what you think.
Now maybe,
please,
if you allow me, thanks for organizing this conference, of course. Yeah, it's opening up so many conversations. Words trigger more words. But I think it's also about precision and who needs precision. So unfortunately, I didn't see the lecture of Samip, but the word haziness is, I like that word very much, but it's of course also something that I suppose an architect very much embraces. But because he needs to operate in a dynamic field, and this is also how Bakema used the word open society. So when he would go to the US, he would talk about segregation and public housing. And when he would go to Berlin, he would talk about very different things from what he would talk about when he was going to Israel, but always using that same term, open society. So this haziness or slipperiness brings a certain versatility for practitioners, or in this case, architects. And then there are other people who are quite precise in terms of legal arrangements or financial arrangements, maybe when language is put down in contracts. So it would be interesting to see what sort of language. There's of course a whole theory of language games, but it would be very interesting to see what sort of precision you seek to achieve, and why exactly. What it would help the project for re-theorizing housing architecture. Does that make sense?
I mean, it absolutely does. I think we've had many conversations about how do we even conceptualize the terms, to sort of build on what Jesse was saying. At one point, we have these amazing maps we were drawing together on these big boards about, just graphically what the relationship is between the concept of a term and a subterm, and these, sort of spatializing the relationship. So what is the work that we want the terms to do for us as we try to unpack the study, the topic?
Yeah.
I would just like to add that one of the benefits of using the term, and I think we felt it in discussions, that it created a collaborative effort. Somehow the fact that people were using a term and they were discussing it, it was not like everybody was like speaking only about his work, but it created the language that was needed to talk about things. And I think this is our challenge. The challenge is to find a way to get terminology back to the discussions, to go back to the ability to talk about things and to have words which are sometimes more precise, less precise, with more meanings or less meanings. But it allowed really a group of people to discuss housing in a very high theory method. And I think this is a great achievement of what was going on in these last days.
Maybe I can invite now any final comments also from the group. We have, unfortunately, if we're going to keep the time, only another minute or two. I know we've been slippery, hazy. Dick says on time.
Maybe just a comment, but it's really a banal concern that it's related to Dirk's suggestions that I think went in the same direction of Simone, Marianne's suggestions to define a structure, a frame that has, we had this preconceived map that has totally been put in discussion by the conference, and I think this was the aim. So I agree that now we have to reframe the structure, and this was just the starting point. I wanted only to highlight that we forced a little bit the decision of some speakers to focus on certain terms often where notion, concept or titles that explain a value or a system of value, and this tentative to translate in one word sometimes, of course, was an exercise that we were asked to the panelists only to define better this map. And that same consideration can be done for the translation, for the linguistic concerns. In many cases, the researchers have focused on a specific localized meaning and had to be translated for the conference. So I think this tension between the wider perspective that can be obtained using the terms as a methods and its value and its localized meaning it's always present in all our papers, and it's something that had to remain. This, I think, double this tension and this double level, the double perspective. Sorry.
I just wanted to apologize for missing this final roundtable. I was teaching, and
We're at the perfect time to conclude, Abigail.
so.
Mariana, did you?
No, just very quickly, I'd like to say that I've learned a lot the last few days, and I'm very thankful for all of you. Of course, especially for the 3 when that I started all this, but to everyone that took part on it and made it possible. So that is already, I think, a real success, because I feel that everybody learned from it, I hope. But what I would like to highlight is there was this shift from being in Jerusalem to being on just remote, and that made me think that we have to take into consideration that the set of terms we receive is something quite obvious, but just since anyone talked about it, I would just like to mention. When we were there, there was something related to costs and to what kind of people could afford to be in Jerusalem at this point. And people from Latin America couldn't afford to be there, of course, because usually a few years ago, perhaps we could, but we have now just very extreme right-wing conservative and I don't know, don't have any more words to say about it. And that is going against the university system, science, everything. So I'm sure Silky, I see that she agrees with me. And then it was, of course, misrepresented. And so what set of terms would come if we organize this in different contexts? I'm just trying to respond to what Priscilla said in the beginning. Would it... Global South version of it sounds very different or not. I think that's something, it's not a criticism on what we've just done, because I just said it was great, but it's something that we have to reflect on, that this kind of methodology made us to construct a kind of geographically situated points of view, and always it was important. So context, as Priscilla said, was important, and but it's not just about context, not just about local, but between the relations between all that, the dissonances that were created when we try to express something in a different language, and when we are forced to speak in a language that we don't have control on it. When I start to speak in English, I don't know if I'm going to be able to say exactly what I wanted to, and that changes all the conversation. And also, when we have to say affordable housing, we don't have that. We don't have. We have social housing, and I remember in a session on Portugal, there was this hard time in saying what was habitação econômica. So I think that makes it very rich. I think I'm very enthusiastic of this kind of international dialogue. I think we learn a lot by what we can do together, and also on the difficulties we have into communicating, due to languages difference, due to different approaches to different locations, and to different what's revolutionary in one place. Nimrod said that sometimes it's not revolutionary in another place, and so that's what made this conference so interesting anyway, although unequal in the sense of that we couldn't have people coming because of costs, and that's very strange, because nowadays everyone is here locked in these computers. So thank you so much again.
If I could reiterate what one of the students said in response to Sami Padora's keynote of this morning. She's a student here in Israel, and she said that she was so happy and surprised to see that the questions that he was bringing up, and the questions and the methods and the types of analysis and built spaces that he was looking at were extremely, relevant for her case. And it is the same. I received similar comments about Silke Kapp's keynote. So in a sense, the architectural language, and I think complements in a sense some of these differences in language. And this is, I think this is why it is super important that in this conference we had presentations from practicing architects as well. And I think that we should aim at least to continue this discussion, the theoretical, historical, analytical on one hand, and then the way that research plays out in architectural design and in the actual work and built environments that that are sometimes, while extremely different, also uncannily similar in Mumbai and in I don't know, Brasilia and in Haifa. So yeah.
I guess we should maybe sort of wrap up. If there anyone like to make final comments, including any of the participants and organizers, research group members.
Well, maybe just a quick, because I was in a kind of in-between condition where I was not a fellow, but I only not just a chair or a presenter. So I was also had the privilege of visiting the group, and well, right before the COVID fell on this world and changed our year since February. And so first, of course, I mean, thank you so much, because this was indeed, let's say, a key moment, I think, in housing, in the discourse, in architectural discourse. I think that we will mark this date, you know, in the coming years, I'm sure. And the thing is that we have to, and what I think you did in such a way that I think has to be emphasized, let's say, is that housing, you just showed that we can also deal with this from our discipline, even though we transgress the discipline then again, right? So we don't need just to rely on the way that housing has been addressed from, you know, as policy, as governance, even though housing is also policy and governance. But I think that what this conference showed is that the people that gave the papers, contributed for the discussions, can also have a say in terms of governance, can also have a say in terms of policy, can also have a say in terms of economy, but also design, technology, and many other things. So in that sense, I mean, when we have the three components of sustainability, you know, the social, the economic, the environment, well, housing is all these three things always. When we think about, you know, the different scales in which architects, urban designers, and everybody operates, I mean, the urban all the way down to the realm of the domestic. Well, housing is about all that, all about all those things. When you talk about, you know, the singular and then the massive, so housing is also all that, right? It's at the same time something that's very precise, very singular, but also something that, you know, can be repeated almost endlessly. And so in that sense, I think these were all things that this conference brought about in very different perspectives. So I think that's, I mean, for me, the greatest takeaway. And in that sense, also suggests that there's many more roads to you know, to walk, and that's also a good thing, because this sort of suggests that we will meet again sometime soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, everybody. If I can just suggest a toast to those of us who have a glass of water or coffee or something.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you to everyone.
Yes.
And I think special thanks to Yael for imagining this and making it happen.
Yes. Thank you, Yael.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you, my cohort, my intellectual cohort. I was maybe out of line in the earlier session, kind of ranting about my intellectual community here in Israel. For me, the very fact that there is a cohort of people so interested in these issues is really fundamental for me. And yeah, and this is why I try to initiate this research group, and Gaia and Suzanne join me in organizing this, conceptualizing this, proposing this to the Institute, which was, by the way, we are the first research group ever funded by this institute. It's mostly, mathematics and Jewish studies. And here we have this completely different topic that they were hosting. And I think that Itzhak Hand's opening congratulations to us really reflected how important they feel that that what we have been doing. So thank you for being my colleagues. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
I think
we are all exhausted, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you, the participants, all the group's members. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you a lot for this opportunity.
Thank you all. And again, thanks for the initiators, and thank you everybody to attend, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Shalom, shalom.
Bye. Bye bye.
Hey.
Bye. Many thanks.